So Travis, let's talk about the differences that you found in assessments around the world. I think you did some comparisons between the US and China and what you found between the EQ assessments in those countries.
Yeah, we've done a lot of comparison studies looking at the differences in emotional intelligence scores between people working in different countries and different cultures. And there's less variability than you might think. A lot of it comes down to situations where you're really drilling down into specific emotional intelligence scores. And that's really the case what we found with China. The study there, we partnered with a group in mainland China who was giving our test in Chinese to native Chinese speakers, executives working in mainland China in the private sector. Did a comparison study in the United States, same thing. These weren't expats, these were US citizens, born and raised, speaking English, executives, and we're taking the test. And we found an interesting thing. There was a large gap in the self-management scores. Overall, Chinese managers, or Chinese leaders, I should say, outscored their American counterparts. But the biggest gap, the place where there was the most inequality, was in self-management. And you see some of these findings, especially if you work cross-culturally and you experience the two environments, where it's quite interesting to look at specific skills.
Let's take a look at the results inside the organization. So what about between job functions? What do you see there?
This is another place where there's a lot of stereotypes and misconceptions that our data contradicts. And the biggest one being that anyone who works in a technical profession has a lower level of emotional intelligence. What we found is that people who are working in sales, ITIS, finance, actually have identical emotional intelligence scores statistically. There's perhaps a 1-point gap between these groups, but when you do a statistical analysis, those scores are basically identical with groups of that size. And that's a big misconception, is that people who work in those professions lack EQ, and that people who are, let's say, working in sales are high EQ individuals. Now, the one place where we see a much higher than average emotional intelligence score based on your job type is for customer service professionals. So these are people who are tasked day in, day out with dealing with difficult customers and having to turn it around. So this is a job that self-selects for emotional intelligence. You do not survive in customer service without having a high EQ. There is one group that has a lower emotional intelligence score on average, and these are engineers. Now, I personally don't believe that engineers are self-selected for lower emotional intelligence. Just like the customer service profession weeds out people with high EQ, I think organizations structure work to actually lower the emotional intelligence or prevent it from improving in engineers. There's a great Fast Company article during the tech boom that was talking about how tech firms were hiring engineers and basically shoving them in a closet. We've got 64 square feet here. We can have 7 engineers work in this area. We'll put, their keyboards are touching, they're rubbing elbows. That's fine. They don't need the space. This is the kind of philosophy that really is embedded in a lot of organizations, not recognizing how important emotional intelligence is even in these technical professions, and not creating an environment that fosters a high EQ. So I think a lot of organizations are really shooting themselves in the foot when it comes to how they devalue emotional intelligence for engineers.
So it may not be that the individuals had lower IQs, the company dumbed down their EQ.
Absolutely. Dumbed it down, devalued it, is really just assuming that they don't need it, that they don't have it, and then you start to lose it.
What about between job titles? Those, say, at the lower parts of the organization versus the higher parts of the organization at the C-level?
Well, speaking of losing it, what we find is that when we take a cross-section of job titles, so you start with individual contributors, people with no supervisory responsibility, and you look at, as they climb the the corporate ladder up into middle management, emotional intelligence scores peak in middle management, right? Organizations are promoting people into management and then into middle management because they're good with people. They say Jim is great with people, his team responds to him, let's make him a manager. And what happens after that? We actually see that emotional intelligence scores go down from middle management to director level, executive level, senior executive, to the C-suite, to CEOs who have the lowest EQ scores in the workforce. Why is this happening? Emotional intelligence is a very big predictor of job performance. So you would assume that the people highest up the ladder, on average, would have the highest levels of emotional intelligence. Well, emotional intelligence predicts job performance for individuals. So if you look at, let's say, CEOs as a whole, those with the lowest level of emotional intelligence in the workforce, the CEOs with the highest level of EQ are the top performing CEOs. The reason you have CEOs having the lowest EQ overall is that organizations promote people from middle management and above based largely on metrics and tenure and industry experience. So they ignore this important variable, and on average, with these job titles, emotional intelligence gets ignored more and more and more, and the overall groups have lower and lower emotional intelligence on average. But within any group, those with the highest levels of EQ are the top performers.
Well, we've all seen some of the articles about the decreasing tenure of especially large company CEOs. Any idea that that might have a correlation, that somehow they're getting promoted to those positions because of their experience or their metrics, but aren't able to hold those positions because they lack the EQ you've described?
Absolutely. I think that's certainly the case. You know, we have a culture in corporate America where we're not looking at the whole picture. And oftentimes you miss and you make the wrong hire, specifically because someone looks good on paper. They have all the what you assume to be the qualifications for success, and that's because we're really being blind to this big piece of the equation, and that's emotional intelligence, which for leaders is more important than any position in the organization because they set an emotional tone for others to follow. They actually prime the emotional intelligence of their entire organization by the tone that they set. That's called primal leadership is the concept there.
Say a little bit more about the concept of primal leadership.
This is really the place where organizations are shooting themselves in the foot by not promoting their leaders based on emotional intelligence. Primal leadership is the concept that leaders prime the entire organization with their emotions. They set an emotional tone for others to follow, whether they realize it or not. So a leader who models emotional intelligence, who is able to effectively manage emotions, to understand the emotions of other people and manage relationships effectively, creates an emotional tone that permeates throughout the organization. It starts with their direct reports and those they work with closest, and that spreads like wildfire throughout the organization. And this is a big reason why you see such emotional intelligence being such a strong predictor of organizational performance as well, and it starts with leadership.